We often define our parents by the narratives they give us. We believe their stability is our shelter. We believe their truth is our history. For 30 years, Sarah's history was simple. Her father, Richard, was a retired accountant, a quiet man who loved reading and gardening. He was dependable, predictable. His sudden death from a silent heart attack was a shock, but not a mystery. The mystery began later, buried in the small details he meticulously left behind. Sarah thought she was just closing a chapter. Instead, she opened a vault containing a secret life, a hidden family, and a complex identity that shattered every foundation of her own memory. Welcome to Heartfelt Confessions. Tonight, we follow the paper trail of a devoted father who was also a brilliant, decades-long liar. This is the confession of Richard, who lived 2 full lives, and the daughter left to navigate the wreckage. The week after the funeral was dedicated to paperwork. Sarah and her mother, Martha, sat surrounded by files, insurance documents, and probate forms. Richard had been an accountant. He was hyper-organized. Every receipt was dated, every tax form filed perfectly. But as Sarah sorted through the papers in his old home office, a room always kept locked, she found an anomaly. Beneath a stack of obsolete software manuals was a hidden envelope, sealed with red wax. Inside, she found a key. It was unlike any key in the house. Heavy, brass, and marked with a single unfamiliar letter, G. Sarah and Martha drove to the local bank. Martha confirmed the safe deposit box was indeed active, but she had never held the key, nor had she ever signed the papers for it. It was listed solely under Richard's name. The bank manager led them down to the vault. When the heavy door swung open, Sarah felt a physical chill. This wasn't about money. This was about secrecy. Inside the small metal box, there was no jewelry or cash. There were 3 items. First, a second passport. The photo was Richard, but the name was Robert Grant. The issue date was 5 years before Sarah was born. Second, a property deed for an address in a small town 300 miles away, a town neither Sarah nor Martha had ever heard of. The deed listed Richard, under the name Robert Grant, as the sole owner. Third, a sealed packet of letters wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. The letters were addressed to Robert Grant in flowing, feminine script, signed simply, E. The shock wasn't just the betrayal. It was the meticulous effort involved. Richard didn't just have a past. He had a meticulously maintained, parallel identity that was decades old. The safe deposit box was the physical evidence of a double life. Martha was devastated, retreating into silence. Sarah, however, became an investigator. The denial gave way to a cold, hard determination to find the truth behind Robert Grant. Using the property deed, Sarah drove the 300 miles to the address listed, 14 Willow Creek Lane. The house was small, well-maintained, and utterly charming. It looked exactly like the life Richard would have designed for himself. Sarah sat in her car across the street, watching, heart pounding. A light flickered on. A woman emerged, carrying groceries. She was middle-aged, warm-looking, with kind eyes. She was quickly followed by a young man in his 20s, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Sarah's deceased father. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The woman was not just a housekeeper. The young man was not just a tenant. This was Richard's second family. The shame and rage were immense, yet Sarah remained still. She could not simply knock on the door and detonate 2 lives. She needed more evidence, more understanding of the timeline. Over the next 2 days, she stayed in a motel nearby, conducting surveillance. She watched the woman, whose name she discovered was Eleanor, and the young man, Michael, go about their lives. They were happy. They were stable. They were living the life Richard had promised Martha, but delivered to Eleanor. She realized the timelines were impossible. Richard had been married to Martha for 42 years. Michael was 23. Richard had been commuting 300 miles on a weekly basis, using the cover of business trips for over 2 decades. The sheer logistics of the lie were staggering. Sarah needed to know when the second life began. She drove back home, went back to the old office, and started digging deeper into the boxes Martha had labeled archive tax returns. She found a ledger book, not the pristine account books Richard used for business, but a small, brown notebook hidden inside an old stereo speaker. This book contained the true confession. It was a coded journal detailing his meetings with Eleanor, their shared life, and the birth of Michael. Richard had coded his entries by substituting financial terms for emotional ones. Quarterly transfer meant visiting Eleanor. Asset acquisition meant purchasing gifts. Profit margin was a reflection on Michael's milestones. The journal entry for the day before Sarah's high school graduation read, executed full-day transfer to asset site. Profit margin currently maxed. Will resume regular scheduling on Monday. Risk assessment low. He prioritized stability for both families, treating love like a business transaction that needed careful accounting. But the most painful entries were his reflections. He often wrote about the constant, debilitating stress of maintaining 2 identities. The cost of the lie, he wrote once, is twice the life I've gained. I have 2 futures and no peace. Sarah realized the heart attack hadn't been sudden. It was the final result of decades of hypervigilance and emotional double-entry bookkeeping. The man who had meticulously organized his entire life was ultimately destroyed by its complexity. The journal gave Sarah the courage she needed. She had to talk to Eleanor, not out of malice, but because they shared a terrible common grief. Sarah drove back to Willow Creek Lane, this time walking right up to the door. Eleanor answered, her smile fading as she looked at Sarah's face. Sarah didn't announce herself. She simply held out the Robert Grant passport. Eleanor looked at the photo, then at Sarah's face, and the truth clicked. The resemblance to Richard was too strong to deny. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, the table Richard had bought them, and talked for hours. Eleanor had believed Richard was a traveling corporate auditor, a single father whose wife had died young. He even brought Michael to Martha's town for business trips, careful to keep them miles apart. Eleanor confessed she had always sensed a reserve in him, a hidden fear he couldn't share. She was just as much a victim of his systemic deceit as Martha. The devastating fallout, however, was with Martha. When Sarah returned and presented the evidence, the passport, the deed, the coded journal, Martha didn't cry. She simply smiled a sad, dry smile. I knew something was wrong, Martha whispered. The distance, the locked room, the unnecessary trips. But I chose to believe the man I married was worth the denial. Martha's confession was the most painful of all. She confessed that years ago, she found a single, non-dated photo of a different woman in Richard's wallet. She confronted him. He denied it, claimed it was a business contact, and she chose to believe him because the alternative was losing everything. She had been living in denial just as long as Richard had been living the lie. The estate was settled quietly. Richard's wealth, which was substantial, was divided equally between the 2 women he married and the 2 children he fathered. Martha took her inheritance and moved to a small cottage by the sea, finally seeking the peace Richard could never give her. Sarah found her half-brother, Michael, to be kind, confused, but open to building a relationship. They shared one painful, complex legacy, the lie that built their lives. The tragedy of Richard wasn't that he lacked love. It was that he was so desperate to possess two different versions of life that he compromised his own peace to achieve them both. He was a man who loved too much and trusted his lies too little. Sarah closed the chapter on her father, not with anger, but with profound pity for the man who spent his life running from the truth and running straight into the one thing he couldn't outrun, his own heart. The attic of secrets was finally empty. The paper trail had ended, but the echoes of the confession would stay with both families forever. Some secrets are kept to hurt others. Richard's secret was kept because he was terrified of hurting anyone. And in the end, he hurt everyone, including himself. The strongest confessions are the ones we hear not from the lips of the deceased, but from the paper they leave behind. This was a heartfelt confession, a story of a father, a forgotten past, and the price of loving two lives too much. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.